Welcome back to another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today in one of the earliest neighborhoods of Cincinnati, Mount Adams. And I'm joined by Jim Steiner. Jim, thanks for having us.
My pleasure, Susie. Glad to be here and hope we'll get to talk about some interesting things.
Oh, we will. So we are at the Immaculata Church, and I would love for you to be able to tell us about when it was founded and why they picked Mount Adams.
Interesting question, and in my humble opinion, an interesting story. If you lived in 1850 and you were Catholic and you went to church regularly, chances are you would be walking 1 mile to 2 miles to church one way. And that got pretty old. So your neighborhood eventually got together and said, you know what? We really need a church in our neighborhood. Let's build one. But before they could do that, they needed permission from the Archbishop or the Bishop. And so they formed a committee, went to meet with the Bishop, and said to the Bishop, we'd like a church in our neighborhood because we're tired of walking so far to church and our kids are complaining. And if the Archbishop said yes, you went ahead and started. But the Archbishop then washed his hands of it. You were totally on your own. You had to raise the money, you had to buy the land, you had to hire the architect, you had to hire the contractor, and then once the church was finished and built, you had to maintain it and keep it running. And that's how churches really were conceived back then. This one is very different. When the first Archbishop of Cincinnati came here in 1830, his first order of business was to travel around the diocese to find out what people needed that he was responsible for. He did that. It took him 18 months. He rode horseback all over. The diocese was the state of Ohio and the territory of Michigan. He got back. He realized the needs were German-speaking priests. So he took it upon himself, this is Archbishop John Purcell, took it upon himself to go to Europe 7 different times to recruit German-speaking priests. He went over in a trip in 1843, got into Switzerland at the mother house of the Precious Blood brothers and priests, recruited 14 people to come back to America with him. They came back, they were on the ship, middle of the Atlantic, got into a big storm. The captain said, we're probably going to die. Get your lives in order.
Wow.
And so what do priests do when they think they're going to die? They pray. And Purcell, in his own inimitable way, prayed to the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the ship made it. And Purcell had promised Mary in his prayers that he would build a votive offering to her on a prominent point in Cincinnati. When he got back, 4 years later, they got back in 1844. In 1848, Purcell purchased the land that this church sits on himself, and he paid for it, about $5,000. 11 years later, in 1859, he began construction of this church, and he had paid for the land, he paid for the stone, he was up here weekly to check on the progress, and some accounts say that he paid $10,000 of his own money for it. So anyway, it got started. He asked people who lived down below to come up and pray at the construction site for the success of the project. And they did. And eventually the project was completed. It was completed in December of 1860. The first Mass was said on December 9th, 1860, and the rest is history. It's been here since then.
Jim, the Passionist Priest came here in 1871. They stayed for 125 years. Can you talk about their service?
I absolutely can. It's a long story, but I'm going to make it short.
Okay, yeah.
Okay? There was a woman in Cincinnati by the name of Sarah Peter, and her full name was Sarah Worthington King Peter because she'd been married twice. Both husbands passed away. Both husbands are very wealthy, very well connected politically, and had a lot of good education. When Sarah lost both husbands, for some reason she converted to Catholicism. In doing so, she took up a cause, and her cause in Cincinnati was to encourage religious orders to come here to do certain things. Like, for example, the Sisters of Charity do hospitals and schools. She wanted to bring the Passionist Order of Priests here. They were in Pittsburgh. She worked with their mother house in Pittsburgh and eventually convinced them to come here. It took 2 different trips to get them here. They finally agreed to come to Cincinnati, take over the Immaculata Church, and use that as their base. So they were going to live here. So they came here in 1871. They took over the church, and they stayed for 125 years, put a very big stamp on the parish by the way they managed the parish. The Archdiocese of Cincinnati turned it over to them, and they did it their way, and they were here until 1996.
Jim, why was there a second church, Holy Cross, open just 2 blocks west of Immaculata?
Doesn't seem to make sense, does it?
No.
Well, it's again another interesting story that's related to the Passionist order of priests, whom we just talked about. When the Passionists came, they're a monastic missionary order. In other words, they cloister themselves to an extent, and they also try to convert people to Catholicism. And that's why Sarah Peter wanted them here. But they needed 2 things when they got here. They said, we don't have a monastery, which is where we'd like to live. And we noticed that the church is a German church. And people always say, Jim, it doesn't matter if it's a German church, the Mass is in Latin. However, the service or the homily or the sermon is in German. And there were English-speaking people that came to the church, the Irish. And there was a large Irish community up here. And they couldn't understand the homily, and they felt terrible. They felt like second-class citizens. So the Passionists said, aha, we need to build a church. Well, they learned about an old observatory that was 2 blocks west of Immaculata Church that was closed because coal smoke and wood smoke from the basin obscured the night sky, and they couldn't observe the stars, so they moved it to Mount Lookout. So there was this empty observatory over there. The Passionists found out about it. They said, that would make a great monastery. So they negotiated with the ownership, were able to acquire that building, and they converted it to a monastery. They added a story to it, a steeple on top, and a cross on top of that, bell on the steeple. They also had extra land, and they built a church, and they called it Holy Cross, and it was for the Irish, and that's how that happened.
Oh, I see. And then they could understand, right? Because they obviously had somebody come in and speak their language.
They had people that spoke English, and so the Irish went there, the Germans went to Immaculata, and that caused some competition on the hill too. It lasted for well over 100 years.
Jim, there's a long-running regional tradition of praying the stairs of Immaculata on Good Friday. We're here at these stairs. You just told me this is the 4th edition. Can you elaborate on that?
Oh, of course I can. It's a very famous regional tradition, and it's attended by 8,000 to 10,000 people every Good Friday. How did it start? Well, we talked about Archbishop Purcell and how he would come up here weekly to check on the progress of the church. And one time he was up here as the church was being constructed, he happened to look down the hill. He noticed that people were coming up and had worn a path up the side of the hill, but he noticed that they were having trouble navigating because it had rained the night before and it was muddy and slippery. He said, we're going to build some steps. So he ordered wooden steps to be built. That was in 1860.
Okay.
The first, and as people came up, we assume or we figure they started praying as they came up. The first written record of the steps being prayed on Good Friday was in 1875, but we figure it started before that. Why do people do it? It's done to honor Christ's passion on the cross when he died on the cross, and they do it to remind themselves of that. It's been going on since probably 1865-ish, and people come up. They don't care whether it's raining, whether it's snowing. The weather doesn't matter. We'll always get between 8,000 and 10,000 people. People ask me how you do it, and you do it your way. It's very personal, and it's very spiritual. And people wait in line for an hour to do it. There are 96 steps. And what's always interesting to me is you'll see family groups doing it. And the family groups are usually grandparents, parents, and grandchildren.
Oh, that's cool.
And it is. And if you get a chance to talk to them and ask the patriarch or matriarch why they do it, they will say, my grandmother brought us, and so we've kept the tradition up. So that it's really become a regional tradition, and it's unfortunately last year during COVID we didn't do it, but we did do it again this year, and the crowds were as big as always.
Jim, we always like to put a little bit of mystery in. So how about the St. Patrick's? There's something with stealing a statue of St. Patrick?
There is. Well, when Holy Cross Church was closed in 1970, the Irish church nobody pre-informed the parishioners. They were not very transparent. So on March 15th, a Sunday, at 11 o'clock Mass, the last Mass of the day, the priest, who was a good Irishman, Wilfrid Flannery, stood up and told the parishioners, by the way, next Sunday you'll be going to Mass at Immaculata Church because we're closing Holy Cross. Stick a dagger in my chest is what the way the parishioners felt.
Yeah.
But, you know, they were very accepting. But a group of them went up to Father Wilfrid Flannery after the Mass and said, may we take St. Patrick, the statue over there, who'd been here since 1920, may we take him with us to Immaculata because he's the patron saint of the Irish. This is a bigger-than-life statue. Father Wilfrid looked at him and said, you know, I wish I could authorize it. I don't have the authority, but you know what I'll do? I'm going to leave the doors open tonight. And he did. And a group of people got a pickup truck, went to Holy Cross Church, and took St. Patrick and brought him over to Immaculata. So when the Holy Cross parishioners came the next Sunday, he was here. There's an Irish fellowship group known as the Hibernians.
Okay.
And the Hibernians caught wind of that and said, what a great idea. Let's do that every year. So ever since 1971, they come to Immaculata. They steal St. Patrick, they put him in a pickup truck, they parade him around the hill, bagpipes and drums, and then they have a Mass and a lunch. And they do it every year. And it's usually the second Sunday in February. And it's really fun, and the public's welcome, and we always have a full house on that
And
day.
they put the bagpipes with it?
Oh, they have bagpipes and drums. I mean, they're Irish. They go nuts.
Yeah, well, I'm Scottish. I kind of understand the Irish.
Well,
So.
and then afterwards, they go over to, there's a place called the Holy Cross Immaculata Annex. It's a bar. It's called Crowley's.
Of course.
It's the oldest Irish pub. And everybody goes there after the services are over and lifts a dram or two.
Celebrates,
Yeah.
of course. Yes,
Yeah.
to St. Patrick, of
Yep.
course. The round window in the facade of the Immaculata has an interesting story. Can you tell us about that?
We're talking about a lot of interesting stories, and there are a lot more that I'm not going to have time for. But yes, the window was installed in 1860 when the church was built, and it weathered almost 90 years, but it had to be replaced. And the parishioners back in 1947 didn't have the money to replace the window. So they filled the opening with concrete blocks. And in the middle of the concrete blocks, they put a glass block cross. When I moved to Mount Adams in 1999, that's what I noticed, and it was not pretty.
Right.
But in 2005, we got a phone call from St. Bonaventure Church over on the west side.
Yeah.
And they said, we're closing our church. We have a round window. Would you like it? And we said, of course we would. Yeah. It's free. And so they brought the window over, and lo and behold, we looked at the opening, which is right up above us here.
That's a huge window. How did they bring it over?
I have no idea.
Okay.
They have their ways.
I guess, yeah.
And,
obviously all intact.
Absolutely, it was intact. But what they realized is that there was an 18-inch gap between the circumference of the window that was free
and the frame.
And the opening. Yeah, so they had to hire a glass artist to build a 18-inch circle of glass so that they can insert the window into that so that it would look correctly. And our free window ended up costing the parish $50,000. So, what's interesting is it's a typical Immaculata story because the parishioners said, "Oh, we've got a challenge here. We better solve it." And they raised the money and put the window in, and it looks a heck of a lot better.
Oh, it's beautiful.
Yeah,
it's beautiful.
And it's lit at night.
Jim, every once in a while, I like to get to places a little bit early. I like to do some exploring. And inside the Immaculata Church, I could not help but notice how gorgeous it is. And since you know everything about Mount Adams, I was kind of wondering if you could expand a little bit on this church.
I certainly can. I do walking tours of Mount Adams, and one of the places we stop, obviously, is the inside of the church. And I always ask people what their impression is when they get into the church. How do they feel? How does it make them feel? I let them sit and think for a couple of minutes, and they always say it's so beautiful, and they're absolutely right. There are 7 large oil paintings that were done depicting events in the Blessed Virgin's life. And those were done by a guy named Johann Schmidt, a German religious artist who lived in Covington. And they're absolutely gorgeous. They're still there. There are Stations of the Cross or around the perimeter on the walls of the church.
Okay.
And then in the back of the church, which actually is the front, there is a life-size crucifix.
Yeah.
And that's a wooden crucifix. It was outside the church, but in 1916, it was desecrated by vandals. They threw stones at it and broke it up. So the parish moved it inside, repaired it, and they replaced it with a twin cross, but it was made out of cast iron. Right. So they got around it that way. So the pews are gorgeous. They're all hand carved. It's just, and of course, if you come to go inside the church, you have to look for St. Patrick, who came over from Holy Cross and has been here since 1970. So it's a gorgeous church.
Yes, absolutely.
And I forgot to mention, the stained glass windows are all original, so they're pretty cool.
Do I assume that those came from Germany?
No, they were made locally, and the
Really?
company that made them is still in business.
Unbelievable.
Yep, up around Middletown.
Oh, that's impressive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, great stuff. Jim, let's go ahead and talk about the recent history of the church. I'm going to let you kind of go on this one.
Okay, well, I'm never sure what recent history means. Is it 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years? So I'm going to pick 50 years ago.
Gentleman's choice.
Yeah, thank you. And 50 years ago, even before that, the parish dealt with lots of changes, and they had to adapt to them. They dealt with a lot of changes from 1970 forward. 1970 is when Holy Cross closed, and the parish and the parishioners had to deal with that change, and they did. They adapted, and they absorbed it, and the church stayed open. Well, in 1976, one of the schools, the last Catholic school on Mount Adams, closed, the Holy Cross School. Families had to deal with that. They did. In 1996, the Passionist Order of Priests, who the parishioners these were the only priests they knew left, and
Right.
that was a real blow, because they were used to the way they did things, and they were really sad when the Passionists left. And then in 2001, our roof was condemned by the city, and another big problem. Then the parish raised almost $750,000 to fix the roof.
Oh, wow.
So they've dealt with changes, and all through the history of the church, and especially in the recent history, and we're coming up on another change. Forever there have been priests living here, and they've lived in the rectory, and they've been resident priests, and they've run the parish.
Right.
Coming July 1st, we're not going to have a resident priest anymore, and that's because of the priest shortage. Our priest is retiring, and we're going to have an absentee administrator, a priest at another parish who's going to be in charge of administration, and then we're going to have visiting priests come in to do our masses. Some of the masses have had to be canceled, but we're still going to have a church, and it's a change, and we hope to be able to adapt to it in the future and be here, and we can do this interview again in 100 years.
I was going to say, it seems to me like you guys have been here for quite some time. I think you can handle another change. And this is kind of a small one compared to what you've already been through.
It certainly is. And I think, I'm always hopeful. I'm always the glass is half full.
Oh, yeah.
And I think we'll do fine.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Besides, I think sometimes people do appreciate the variety, if you are going to have people coming in. So
exactly.
One interesting thing about you is you have written a couple of books, and I would like for you to elaborate on those if you could.
Thank you for the opportunity to plug my books. The first book I wrote was in 2010, and it was in honor of the 150th anniversary of Immaculata Church. The title is Immaculata on Mount Adams, a 150-year history. It's about 170 pages long, lots of pictures, hardcover. It's no longer in print. Sold them all. All the money went to the church. It is available at the Cincinnati Public Library, so if anybody wants to do a deeper dive into the history of the Immaculata Church and Holy Cross, they're both in the book. But I've just published another book that was in December of 2020. It's on the history of Mount Adams, and it goes deep into the history of Mount Adams. The title is Mount Adams, A History. It begins in 1780 and ends at the current time.
Yeah.
It's hardcover, 360 pages, over 300 images. And if anybody is interested in acquiring a copy, you can go to hillyes.org.
Awesome.
And there's a website for it, and you can buy it. It's also at local bookstores.
Hill, yes, you have a good sense of humor, Jim. One thing that you had mentioned earlier, you and your wife, do you guys ever personally deliver a book?
Oh my gosh. Yeah, thanks for the question. That's part of our concierge book delivery service. My wife and I deliver the books. If you order one on the website, we'll deliver it to your house, usually the next day.
I think that's really cool.
We
yes.
like to do it.
Unless you're in California, do not expect next day service.
That's true. We have to mail it UPS,
okay.
USPS.
USPS, there you go.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, this was fantastic. Is there anything that I didn't bring up that you're just like, oh, by the way, this thing's really cool. If you now's your chance. Otherwise, we're gonna.
I think we've bored people enough.
Are you kidding me? This is great. Look at this view.
I know, isn't it great?
And this history, this is rich. I mean, talking about the generations, like this is Cincinnati. This is Cincinnati. You just talked about why Cincinnati is so great, and this is a piece of it. But this is a strong piece of it.
Yeah, it is.
Like that, I'm proud of this city for stuff like that.
Exactly, and I am too. That's what keeps me going.
Thank you for watching another episode of History in Your Own Backyard. I'm your host, Susie Selleck, here today in this beautiful neighborhood of Cincinnati, Mount Adams, joined by Jim Steiner. Jim, thank you again for having us here at the Church of Immaculata.
My pleasure, Susie.
And remember,
travel slowly and stop often.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.